If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this, people who have encountered creepy paranormal things, what's something scary that has happened to you that you never want to experience again? I used to live in Oregon, Virginia, USA, in the middle of nowhere, relatively close to Civil War battlefields. I'm not going to go into all of them right now, but here's one. The very first encounter I had there was when I was about 7 years old. We moved there when I was about 6.5. I was walking out the front door in the middle of the day to get the mail. As I was going down the steps, I noticed there was a little girl around my age across the street. She was standing, staring vacantly out the window. She was wearing a white dress with puffy sleeves and a pink sash around the middle, had medium-length golden curly hair, and was wearing a matching white bonnet with a pink ribbon on it. I think her shoes were white too, but the dress was too long to notice. I don't remember seeing a face because of the angle she was at. When I saw her, I thought to myself, oh, neat. A new kid moved into the neighborhood. I should introduce myself. And then I looked down to wipe my mouth since I had just brushed my teeth, though I may have had toothpaste there. When I looked back up, she was gone. A few days later, I was talking to the neighborhood kids about what I had seen, and they finished my description and said they had seen her too. She sometimes comes to play in their yard and then disappears if someone tries to get close. My ex-wife saw the Hat Man. It was when she was way younger and living at home. We hadn't met yet, and her dad was really angry person. She didn't like to talk about him because it usually seemed to call him or something. Actually, now that I think about it, she mentioned the whispering sounds a lot. It was obviously more apparent when she was home alone. I think he's drawn towards those feelings, and I think he makes the person more susceptible to other occurrences as well. Because she's had several near possession type moments in her life. One involved a really scary encounter we had at a graveyard in the country, a disembodied growl and a friend being in hysterics because of something he saw. I had to almost physically restrain her from getting in the car and going back to the cemetery, and when she woke up the next day, she had no memory of what happened. We both had intense nightmares that night, too. It was a crazy time. Being attacked by an evil spirit. My girlfriend at the time was sitting with me in my living room around 11 p.m. talking about the last semester she studied abroad in Uganda. She spent a week in Rwanda and was telling me about the experience. Specifically, how scared she was when her group descended into a cave made from the bones of victims who died in the genocide. It was for education and to fully grasp what happened there. While she was telling it, the room began to physically feel darker, even though it wasn't, if you can at all understand that. Like the lights were dimming and things were hushed, even though they weren't from what I could tell. Then, there was overwhelming fear, a sense of dread, and panic, and my eyes focused on one spot a few feet in front of us. Her eyes did too. It felt like someone was there and watching us angrily. The way you can feel when someone else is home or has entered a room before you hear them. We're Christians, so we started praying. While beginning the prayer, suddenly I felt whatever it was rush me and then physically go through me. It felt almost electrical, like a gust of wind. I immediately started feeling nauseous. We prayed harder and decided to step out. Outside, she told me she started hearing voices before we left. Saying, "Let me have her. Let me have her. Let me have her." Nothing else really happened after that. We assumed something dark attached itself to that place, and talking about Rwanda stirred it up. I never want that terrible feeling again. Walking from my friend's house to my tent in NH one night to grab clothes, it was really dark. While doing so, I was about to turn around. I couldn't see my tent, it was so dark. When I glanced back at my tent to try and see it one more time, I noticed what looked like a beam of light by my ankles heading towards my now visible tent. I figured it was the moon. I felt like a child and balanced in it while walking, when all of a sudden the worst feeling I have ever felt washed over me. It felt like something powerful swung over me to stop me in my tracks, and I got the instant feeling to look up instead of keeping my eyes on my feet. I looked up, there was something 3 to 4 feet tall standing up, gray, like an alien humanoid thing right next to my tent. I froze and said, "Oh God, no." As it took 2 steps towards me, and once I said that, I ran frickin' fast inside the house. When I swung the door open, nobody noticed I flew into the house, even though they were right in front of me. When I came home that weekend, I lost a lot of weight in the weeks to come. It wasn't a deer, I know what I saw, but I don't know what I saw. The feeling that came over me was so horrible, almost as if everyone in my family had all died at once. 9-year-old me camping deep in the woods with my uncle and stepfather in Paraguay many years ago. I couldn't sleep at night due to the many voices coming from the cold wind speaking in a language I couldn't understand. When I opened my eyes to look outside for maybe people walking nearby, I ended up spotting the silhouette of some animal walking like a person but lacking its arms, moving among the darkness and trees close to the tent. Scared, I went back to my sleeping position and kept my eyes shut, not moving a muscle, pretending I was asleep. I was so afraid to move, thinking that it would alert the thing to our presence, that I didn't dare wake up my stepfather or my uncle sleeping by my side. I was the closest to the tent entrance. At one point, when the winds quieted down, I opened my eyes and saw the creature close to the tent entrance, checking inside, a mere meter away from me. I think I immediately fainted due to the scare, but some details stuck with me. It looked like a big, hairy thing with the head of what looked like a dog. Its limbs were half cut. It was standing on all fours on what would be his elbows or knees because it had no forearm or lower leg. By the morning, I told my Paraguayan uncle, and he told me that I shouldn't have whistled after dark. It attracts bad things in the woods, he said. I have no idea if he didn't believe me and was just ducking me over with the whistle thing, but yeah, I never went back there, and I don't intend to. Duck that forest. I am part of a paranormal team in Northern Ireland called Northwest Paranormal Research. We visit haunted locations all over the island of Ireland. But this one is probably the worst of all. We parked the cars about 500 feet from the actual house. I walked up a bit of the road, then up the lane, where, at the time, it was all lined with a dense forest. We go inside the rundown old cottage. There is no do so. So, in our heads, we're all thinking, it's all going to kick off now. But it doesn't. Not for another 20 minutes. It gets cold. And I mean Arctic cold. We can see our breath, yet the ambient temperature is 8 degrees Celsius. We hear little ticks, like someone throwing rice or something at us. But we can't see anything. We have 2 night vision cameras, and there's nothing showing up on those either. Then, from the laptop, we can see spikes in the audio, but we can't actually hear anything with our ears. There's definitely something going on, but we can't nail it down. Then Siam Haith hears somebody calling her name being whispered into her ear. Then I hear mine. But we have no recorded evidence of this, despite having all this tech with us. We pull out a small table and a glass to do divination. And no, this is not like a Ouija board, this is a simpler form of communication. As we have our fingers on the glass, we ask out. Is there anyone out there who would like to communicate? The glass immediately starts to swing violently around the table. We ask for the glass to stop, but it doesn't. We decide that it's getting a bit too intense, so we pack up and decide to leave. On our way down the lane, we were just chatting amongst ourselves about the goings-on. As we crossed the ditch at the bottom, I heard these chilling words roar at me, right into my ear. Never return, we haven't been back since. Other people have experienced bad things, but we will never return. So we have had numerous paranormal experiences in our home, from voices, whether audible to the ear or through spirit boxes, to shadows, footsteps, everything you can think of, we've witnessed, but this one specific time is the first time I personally have truly felt what it was like to be frozen with fear. We kept seeing a child spirit standing on the stairs. He would walk up and down and then just stand and watch. There were no features, he was just a dark silhouette. So I decided to sit on the floor directly underneath where this child was standing. That's when things got scary. I all of a sudden couldn't move, I was that terrified, and I hadn't even witnessed what was happening. My fiancée saw this child silhouette rise up and become what she described as a male adult. We have always felt child spirits were something sinister, and this certainly verified it for us. I have never felt fear like it, and I have had experiences since I was a kid. So I live in a very old house and have been there my entire life. My mom claims that the paranormal has always been in the house, and my dad always said it was BS, and I only just started getting paranormal experiences a few years ago. I will put these in order of what I believe is the least to most spooky. The first is classical music. My mom claimed that in her old bedroom every night in the early AM, she would hear classical music playing quietly. My house has been renovated, and a bigger master bedroom has been built, so I'm now in the old master bedroom. As a high school student with sleep problems, I've been up all night a lot, and every time I am awake, at exactly 4 AM, I hear classical music start playing quietly, and I always zone out afterwards, so I never notice when it stops. Secondly, there are the shadow people. I've always seen random shadows move around out of the corner of my eye, but I always thought I was just seeing things, until this one time I was hanging out in my room and I saw a shadow of a tall man wearing a hat on my wall. I knew it wasn't just the shadow of my ceiling fan because those shadows tend to stay on the ceiling, and my room light is very soft and dim, so all the shadows that cast in my room are usually very soft, but this shadow was intense and deep black. I also know that it couldn't be coming from outside because my blinds were shut and there were blackouts. As soon as it seemed that the shadow noticed that I was watching it, it ran off. Thirdly, My family's Ouija went missing. This is the type of Ouija board that I would call real because my great-grandfather carved it, so it wasn't just one of the game ones you can get at Walmart. This happened just when I was planning to use the board to see if I could contact whatever was in my house. It was always kept under my parents' bed, but the day I planned to use it, it disappeared. My parents, my friend, and I tore apart the house looking for it, but it was never to be seen again. My dad is actually making me a new one for my 17th birthday, and I will keep a close eye on this one. The last one solidified my belief in demons because I believe that what happened was the work of a demon. So a bit of backstory for this one. I was an edgy child and often said I wanted to die, untrue, and all my friends were also edgy, so they would ask, "When do you want to die?" And every time I would say something along the lines of, "If I'm not dead by the time I'm 16, I want the devil to drag me down to hell." This happened the night of my 16th birthday in the early AMs. I had randomly woken up around 3 AM and I felt sick, so I stood up in case I was going to throw up, but as soon as I stood, I blacked out and came through about an hour later. I was still standing at the same stop, but I was wearing different clothes, a different pajama set that I only used in the winter, and it was summer, and my room was a mess. My pillows and blankets had been thrown off the bed, my books and pop figures were all over the place, and my cross that I had up was taken down. This could have been something more logical, but I believe it was paranormal. Every day for almost a year, I have woken up around 4 AM to the feeling of being watched. I used to live in Germany, extremely close to Bergen-Belsen. At the time, I had a golden lab and a dachshund, and we used to go to one of the fire breaks in the forest every day for a good run despite rain or snow. They would both be on leads in the car park and past the barbecues and picnic benches, but once we were through the gate, they would run full pelt up and down the track, in the woods and bushes, and generally be happy dogs. One day we went there, a pleasant spring day. I parked my car, there weren't any other cars there, but that's not unusual. I got the dogs out of the back of my car and started off on our regular walk. Both dogs were tucked right into my ankles, tails down, ears down. We went past the barbecue park and went through the gate. I took the leads off expecting to see two tails disappearing into the woods as normal, but no. They were still at heel, and they were sort of trying to get me to stop walking by standing right in front of my feet. It then struck me what an odd atmosphere there was. Dark, depressing, and feeling watched. Time seemed to slow down. It didn't, but it felt like it, and the woods were silent, which was totally wrong. By this point, the dogs were definitely blocking the way and had their hackles raised, so I turned back towards the car park. I have never seen the dogs run so fast. By this point, I was running too. And we got in the car and drove home. I mentioned this to a friend who also walked her dogs there, and she had had the same experience that day too. So, it's about 2:54, or so, at night, and I'm finally getting ready for bed. Keep in mind that this is around the regular time I usually go to bed, so I'm not worried at all. So, I'm at the door to my room, and I open the door and start getting ready for bed. I lay in bed, cover myself with soft, fluffy blankets, and continue to watch videos until I get sleepy. About 1 or 2 hours later, I finally fall asleep and stay asleep for the next couple of hours, until I am awoken by a beam of bright yellow light hitting my eyes. I wake up to find that my closet door is open ever so slightly. I sit up in my bed, staring at my closet door, unsure if I had possibly left it open and just didn't notice or if it opened by itself. After a while of staring, the door began to slowly crack open more and more and more, until it was completely open. I was left frozen in shock. I mean, I had seen shadow figures, heard things, and sensed things, but I had never ever seen something move on its own. I was now looking at the closet and wondering if I should get up and investigate when I suddenly felt a wave of fear come over me. It was like I had felt something there yet hadn't physically seen anything at all. It was terrifying. I began to scream and cry, kicking my legs around frantically as if something were on me and I was trying to get it off. I felt helpless, alone, and scared, and I was unable to even begin to understand why I was so terrified. I mean, nothing even actually happened. Luckily, it didn't take long for my sister to wake up and run to my door. However, when she tried to open my door, it was locked, and she kept screaming for me to open the door, but I was too scared to even get off my bed. My sister had to run downstairs to get the lockpick, and I need to remind you that I never locked my door. After all that happened, my sister was very upset with me because I woke her up over a closet. Now, months later, I've begun to see a strange and surprisingly very short girl-like figure all over my room. Anyway, I'm sure all of this is pretty explainable, but I still choose to believe that I encountered and am still encountering a ghost. If anyone was wondering, yes, my door still randomly locks itself, so yeah. Almost 32 years ago, I was 19 and went to Pennsylvania in the summer to visit my best friend from high school, who moved to York after graduation. He got us a well-paid 1-month restoration job in a Philadelphia Millionaires Club, a huge complex in the center of the city. We had a room and could sleep during the day and work all night. It had been many things in its over 200-year history, both a war prison and a hospital. The first night things were weird, but as the month progressed, the sightings began getting more terrifying, especially when we challenged the spirits. We saw Bigfoot walk down a hall and disappear. We saw mangled men dart across the hallways in lit areas. We saw shadow people, who had hats and coats and glowing eyes, levitating near the unlit area ceiling. The worst was a cordoned-off area we were not supposed to enter. We didn't. But we could look in and did see a large, ornate set of doors with weird carvings, but that wasn't the horrifying part. We saw shadow wraiths, golem types but pitch black with glowing red eyes, crawling all over the walls and ceiling. When I was a kid, we had to leave our house and everything we owned because we were chased out by something evil. This one might be crazy, and a lot of it I was told by my mom and brother, and some I personally remember. From what my mom and brother told me, our dad would practice witchcraft pretty often and would spend hours alone in the garage trying to talk to the devil, and because of that, he basically invited any and all evil spirits to our house. At first, it would start with my toys popping up in random places, and at one point, my mom would throw the toy away in hopes of getting rid of whatever spirit may be attached to them, but she would later find them back in my toy box in a way, saying you weren't getting rid of me that easily. But then it got worse. We would sometimes come home to the house banging and shutting every door in the house that we were in. Too scared to go home, and at nights it was common to wake up to screaming or for a shadowy figure to be standing over us, but the final straw for my mom was her finding me alone in my dad's garage at 3 a.m. I wasn't even aware of what was going on. All I remember from that night was my mom screaming my name, but after that, we left. Even after leaving, the evil spirit seemed to have attached itself to me because it would haunt my dreams. Every night was the same dream with a white old man very angry at me, looking at me nose to nose. I was 5 at the time, with no understanding of why this man was upset with me or that he was a demon, and my brother had it the worse, to the point that he suffers from mental issues and is extremely religious because of it. I'm trying to understand what just happened to me and my boyfriend. We were in a large parking lot, parked towards the end, away from all the other cars. All of a sudden, a car pulls up and parks in 2 spaces to our left. A man gets out, stands for a second, looking confused or disheveled, looks at us, and then walks to the back passenger door and opens it. He pulls out a large sign, at least a few feet long, that has a few bold, black numbers on it. He holds the sign at us, stares directly at us for a few seconds, and then looks up to the sky and salutes. He then puts the sign back in the back seat of the car, walks around to the driver's door, and drives away, disappearing within seconds. My boyfriend and I were so confused and freaked out that it took us a second to understand what just happened. My boyfriend recalls seeing the letter M, followed by some numbers. But I only recall seeing 1677, no letters. Most importantly, why did this man park next to us, get out of his car, hold up a sign of numbers or letters for us to read, and then disappear? We feel like we experienced a glitch in the simulation or aliens. It was that weird. I just wanted to share this experience that happened when I was younger, and it still haunts me to this day. So it starts with me and my sister going to visit my aunts in a little ghost town in South Dakota for a vacation. I'd say I was 12 somewhere around there anyway. It was the scariest experience. There were many instances that happened, but I'm going to talk about one that scared me the most. It was still light outside around 2-ish, and my aunt goes to go get groceries with my cousins, and me and my sister stay home. It was about 30 minutes after everyone was gone that I and my sister were out in the living room. I'm on the laptop playing a game, and all of a sudden you hear a door close upstairs. Me and my sister look at each other, kind of spooked, but don't really think anything of it till about 3 minutes later we hear the water from the sink in the restroom upstairs start running, and at that point I'm just in shock because the water shouldn't even be running at all. We'll sit there for about a minute just to see if it turns off or something, but all of a sudden we hear a cup sounding like it's getting filled up and then just drops on the floor, then right after that it just does it again, a cup getting filled with water then falling. I would say it happened 5 to 6 times the whole time that was happening. We both couldn't move. We were just staring at each other till finally my sister goes upstairs and I follow her, but I end up in front of her and slowly walk up to the restroom, where you could hear a cup fall. One last time I finally had the courage to open the door, and nothing happened, no water on, no cup, nothing, nada, an empty regular restroom. As soon as we wrapped our heads around what happened, we ran down the stairs, and I tried to open the door, but I couldn't. It felt like I was getting all choked up. Then we heard the restroom door close and the water turn on again. Oh hell no, we ended up opening the door and waiting outside, crying our eyes out. When I was about 9, my brothers and I stayed at my grandparents' for a weekend. They lived out in the boondocks, an area that had just been cleared and started to develop. They were the 4th house built there, but the neighborhood next to the area was fully developed and populated. One night, we, grandparents, aunt, myself, and 3 brothers, were all sitting outside in the light of the light post that was next to our house and by the, still dirt, road. We were watching a TV that was sitting on the windowsill but pointed outside. Those were warm nights in Mexico, so we sat outside in the cool breeze of the night. Out of nowhere, we start to hear a lot of barking. The dogs from the neighborhood nearby had started barking at something all at once. The barking reached the second neighborhood, and immediately the barking became an army. I've never heard anything like it since. So many dogs barking at once, some crying, some howling, insanity. Suddenly, we realized the dogs were coming en masse down the street towards us. We all jumped up to attention and just stared down the street. There, by the light of the farthest light post, a group of dogs came into view, and then more, and then more. The street was covered in dogs, except for one spot, right in the middle. They were all barking at this spot. My grandfather quickly grabbed his shotgun and walked right towards the mass of barking chaos. He thought it was a wild animal the dogs were chasing. He was one light post distance away when he stopped, put his shotgun down, and walked back to us. He told my grandma, "This is of no use here," gesturing at the shotgun, "This one is on you." My grandmother was an extremely devoted Catholic and carried her Bible everywhere. It sat by the TV, and she rushed over to grab it and quickly looked for a page on it. The dogs reached the light post my grandfather was at earlier, and we saw it. There, in the middle of the dog pack, was a woman walking down the street. She got closer, and I saw what my grandfather saw. She was floating about a foot off the ground. She was still making the gesture of walking, but her feet were nowhere near the ground. The dogs would take turns trying to bite her feet, but upon their attempt, they would cry as if hurt and run back, and another dog would take its turn, and so on and on. My aunt became terrified and grabbed our kids. She tried to cover our eyes and yelled at us not to look at it. It became evident to me that this was a serious thing happening when my aunt, a non-Catholic, started praying. We were more curious than anything, weirded out by the scene but not scared yet. My grandmother had started praying, and the dogs dissipated when they reached her. They just ran off in all directions, about 60 or more dogs that were still there. That's when I saw her up close, and my life changed. She had wavy hair that was flowing behind her as she walked and no face, nothing like a blur, but it was flat, hard to describe. The terror overtook me at that point, and I couldn't look away. Her dress was like an old-timey summer dress that covered the shoulders and dropped to just above her ankles. I could almost see a print on it. Her feet were transparent, as was the bottom of her dress, which trailed behind her like smoke, but not like smoke, like it was torn. She had a slight glow to her, like she was walking in midday, but her color was gone. She was pale, her dress was pale, and her hair was white. And no face. Our cries at that point triggered both my grandfather and my aunt to pull us into the house. As I was making my way into the house, I looked back and saw my grandmother holding her Bible and confronting this being face to face. We could hear a woman screaming very loudly and suddenly crying and cursing. We looked out the window to see the woman in white rapidly float over a nearby drainage canal and disappear. My grandmother walked back inside with a big grin on her face, and all she said was, "Don't worry, she won't be back." I was forced to become a believer that day. I didn't ask for it, nor did I want it. I suddenly became just a believer. My sister called me while I was at work, asking if I was home. I said no. She proceeded to start crying, and she told me she heard me walking up the steps. I lived upstairs, turning on the light, and calling down to her using her full name. Her name was May Smith, the name that was called to her was Mary Beth Smith, and asking her to come upstairs. Well, she left the house, and I got home 10 minutes later. TV was on, and I heard a voice like my sister's saying, "Hello?" And I go, "Hey, may I think you left?" And I turned around the corner, and the TV was off, and no one was there. I walked to the bathroom and turned to my sister's room across the hall after hearing a single knock, and that's when I saw a picture of her fly or fall off the wall. Being the dumbass I was, I go, "Okay, if someone is really here, do that again." A couple seconds pass, and a picture of me falls off her wall. She had a wall of pictures of family members and friends in her room, like a collage thing. Nothing eventful happened after that. It turned out that the night before, my sister was over her friend's house playing with an Ouija board and didn't close it out. I never had another paranormal experience, But my sister has unfortunately had issues her entire life since then. This was 10 years ago. I was about 12, and me, my mother, and my sister were traveling to my grandparents' house. Me and my mother were in the front, and my 9-year-old sister was in the back. It was late when we started moving, and along the way there were roadworks, so we had to divert off a side road. As we drove, I turned to my mother after 15 minutes and told her we had passed a sandpile on the side of the road the second time, to which she said, "Oh, have we?" We saw a sign for a B&B pointing right, so we took that road. There were no houses anywhere. We traveled maybe 5 minutes when we came to a straight stretch of road with trees on both sides. I noticed there was what looked like a big white bag stuck in the trees. But it wasn't a white bag. This thing came off the trees and took the form of a woman wearing a dress who leisurely floated about a foot above the road, stopped in the middle of the road, turned to face the car, and pointed before turning and moving to the other side of the road. I was frozen and said nothing for a few seconds until we passed the part of the road it had been on before I turned to my mother, wide-eyed and visibly shaking, and asked her, "Did you see that?" My mother looked from the road and at me for a second, obviously terrified, and said, "You saw that?" My sister saw nothing. It doesn't end there. During the trip, we saw white mice running in circles in the middle of the road and a fox running ahead of us, staring back at the car. A cat on a wall and a limping dog were looking at us as we drove past. When we got to our grandparents', I started trying to draw what I saw. I don't know why, but I took the first letter from each of the animals and turned to the adults and said, "Connell's father might die, I do not know any Connells." My mother looked at me and said, "Where did you get that from?" To which I responded, "Connell's, cat. Father, fox. Might, mice. Die, dog." We later found out that, after a week or so, my mother has distant O'Connell's relatives. Mrs. O'Connell died within the month. It scared the shit out of me. I said father when it was the mother who passed away. I'm from Ireland, where this happened, and we have this thing called the Banshee. I only encountered it this one time, a woman who appears in families with M or O in their names right before their family members are about to die. The Banshee is also known for sending people in circles, which is why I believe we passed that sandpile a second time. Some have reported hearing gut-wrenching screams, which are also attributed to her. I will never forget that night. My roommate and I decided to visit my mom a couple of holidays ago. I know this guy really well, and we are great friends even to this day. When we visited, we stayed in my room, which has a window that can directly look into my mom's living room. We did the usual thing and stayed up talking, listening to music, and having a great time. At about 1:30 a.m., we decided it was time to turn in. I had my 2 dogs sleeping with us at our feet. For some reason, I wasn't able to sleep. I felt kind of weird, but I chalked it up to just being awake late and traveling. At around 2 a.m., my oldest dog suddenly sits up, stiffens, and stares at the window that looks directly into the living room. I noticed that body position right away because he usually does that when he's frightened or sees somebody new. Except he isn't barking like he usually does, he was stiff but shaking in a way that made me feel worried. My other dog notices, gets up, and looks out the window too. Her ears go up, and she becomes frozen, almost like a statue. I feel scared at this point, but I am not sure why. Something felt really off at this point. My roommate gets up, and when he looks out the window, I see his eyes become wider than I have ever seen them before. I don't have my glasses on, and it's dark, so I can't see anything. My roommate is frozen, looking out the window. I ask, "What is it? Why is everybody looking out there?" My roommate is only able to make a scared mutter. I ask again, but louder and with more urgency. He looks at me and says with a quiet voice, "You don't want to know." I then ask, "Is somebody in the house? Do I call 911? I then quickly remembered setting the alarm for the house, which has motion sensors and door/window alarms. My dogs are still stiff with fear, and my roommate looks back out the window. He tells me, "It's not human." At that point, I was freaking out, and I ran to the window as fast as I could with my eyes shut, slammed the blinds down, and turned on the lights. My dogs and my roommate were still staring out the window. I asked him what he saw. He told me that there was a pale old man staring into the window straight at us. I asked him to describe the man, and he perfectly described my 9-month-old dead grandfather. He had never seen my grandfather, he hated pictures, and I never had any around. After about 30 minutes of sheer panic, we decided to open the blinds again because, why not? The man was gone. We did not sleep for the rest of the night. My sister and I were staying at my parents' house. They live in this old farmhouse from the 1920s in North Carolina, in the US. We were both grown with children. We had babies around the same time, so my youngest and her only child were with us that night. They were about 2 years old at the time. This farmhouse is relatively small. The bedrooms all connect to the large family room on one side of the house, with the kitchen and attic access on the other. Anyway, my sister and I had just put the babies down in the spare room. At the time, we put them in the big bed and my dad has a hunting dog kennel in the yard. Those dogs bark if a butterfly lands on the mailbox. They didn't make a sound the entire experience. Dad gets up, checks the attic, and around the house, everything. I didn't even really believe in paranormal events until this experience, and I'll never forget it. I was a teenager and lived in this house, San Antonio, Texas, that was foreclosed on by the bank. It started very slowly, like little taps and knocks on the wall that I originally wrote off as house noises. Then SHT started getting really weird. One day, I was doing my college online in my room when I heard the door slam, so loud it shook the house, and footsteps running up the stairs. I thought my high school-aged brother had skipped school and come home early. Then he got home at his normal time of 4 p.m. I asked him if he had come home, and he looked at me like, no? That was when it started. One night I woke up out of a dead sleep because I swore, still do, I could have been dreaming, but I doubt it, that there was something or someone literally an inch away from my face. I can't describe the feeling. My boyfriend and I at the time would hear the loudest bangs coming from upstairs when it was just him and me in that house. I mean, it sounded like something was picking up the furniture and dropping it. Above all, the scariest thing I ever saw was a lady. It was broad daylight. I was in the kitchen making food, and I looked up, and right across the counter or bar was a lady walking. She looked more like she was on roller skates or something. She was kind of seething and white, fucking cliche, I know, but the scariest thing was that she turned her head and looked at me. Her eyes looked like black rocks or buttons, and I know she saw me. I saw her that one time for less than a second and never saw her again. We moved out of that house, but my mom still owns it and leases it out. I really want to ask the renters if they hear anything. But it's not a good idea. When I was 13, I had a rich friend who invited me to a sleepover at his house, which really excited me because my mammy and I lived in a shitty little flat in a famously not super nice part of London. My friend lived in a pretty standard 3-story Victorian 4-bed, 2-bath in a nicer suburb, but to me it felt like an absolute mansion. Anyway, go over to my friend's place for the sleepover and discover his parents have basically shut themselves away in the top story and given us 6 boys the run of the rest of the house. Even more exciting. Sleepover is underway, we're hanging out and doing normal teenage boy shit. Me and the host are in the kitchen fixing a late-night toasty snack for everyone, and I very distinctly hear a woman's voice say, "Hello? Are you there?" from the utility room behind us. I immediately whip around and see through the empty door that nobody is there. I ask my friend, "Was that your mom?" He gets really weird and defensive and insists he didn't hear anything, and I'm just being weird. I was like, okay, I guess not, and dropped it. Later on, we decide that Bloody Mary is a good idea. Important note here, I've always been a small, skinny, pasty dude, and I have duck-off bright ginger hair. We go in 2 at a time in the downstairs bathroom. Host and 1 boy go in, nothing. Me and another boy go in. Nothing. The last 2 boys go in, come running out screaming, and are furious at me. They demand to know what the hell I was thinking and how the hell I even did that. I have no idea what they're talking about, and they explain that they both saw a short, pale red-headed figure standing in the corner, facing the wall behind them in the mirror. They took a lot of convincing that it wasn't me, literally no way I could have sneaked into the room without them noticing, and again, the host got weirdly defensive when he kept telling them they made it up or imagined it. I never got an explanation or thought of what it could be. I still kind of believe the place was haunted. My friend knew and was in denial about it for some reason, but I don't know why. I never got invited for another sleepover, anyway. The Hunchback. My home city has a large park just over a kilometer, about 0.7 miles, long. It's Wales/UK, so one end opens out near the castle, and the other is a small wood with a river and 2-foot bridges out of the park to the west, and the east is mostly fenced and apart from my entry point. I was walking home late from a friend's house. I'd been on an exercise kick, and the hour-long walk around the park's perimeter would have gotten me up to 20,000 steps in one day. By the time I reached the park, however, I was feeling pretty tired, so I decided to go through as a shortcut. I do stupid stuff like this all the time. I'm a large man with all the tremendous privilege this brings, even though I have been attacked at night a couple of times over the years that have tended to happen near bars and clubs as opposed to the deserted park. Also, prior to this, I hadn't heard of any crimes connected with this park at night. I'm not sure why I did it, But when I entered the park, instead of turning left past the ornamental gardens, over a 1-foot bridge, and out of the park, my tired brain thought that going right towards the northern footbridge would be a quicker route. After a few minutes, I realized I'd made an error. Not only was this way slightly longer, but it was also as silent and lonely as a tomb. To the right of the path, there was a recreational field, and to my left, a small wood. I should point out that I grew up near forests, so they are a second home to me, and I know their sounds well and spent much time in them at night. After about 5 minutes of walking along the wide, curving path, I did a routine peek behind me and spotted someone following. They were quite a way back at that point, and I could have easily blotted them out with my thumb. Usually, this wouldn't have unnerved me, but they had their hoods up and were walking with an unusual gait, as if they had something wrong with their spine or legs. I reasoned it was probably a homeless guy, and if he had issues walking, he wasn't going to catch up with me. I didn't even know if he could see me, as I was in a much darker part of the park. As I continued walking, though, he seemed to keep pace and even gained slightly on me. Every time I turned around, I could see his head bobbing with his unusual gait. Weirdly, and I'm not sure if this was due to the darkness, my eyesight, or just the way I remembered it, but he looked like a cliché hunchback from an old Hammer horror movie. He was creeping me out now, and I wondered if he was high, and that's why he was staggering, so I pulled an old trick. I used a lot to escape forest weirdos as a child and enter the woods. I knew about 5 or 6 feet into the trees I would be near invisible. I went in 10 just in case and crouched into a bush, donning my navy-colored COVID face mask and putting my hood up to mimic my high-albedo Celtic pale skin showing up from the road. After a couple of minutes, I heard him approach, grunting as he struggled to move his body. Illuminated only by the moonlight, he got to where I had vanished, which coincided with a bend that would have temporarily obscured me from view when I slipped into the woods. My logic is that if he were following me, he might give up now. I did at this point feel kind of bad that if he were a man with a disability walking home, my disappearance might also have scared him. That said, there had been enough weird crimes during lockdown for me to be primarily thinking of my own safety. At least I knew I wasn't going to attack him. I waited for a few minutes, and after passing my hiding place for a few meters, he stopped and looked around him. He was breathing heavily, and I got my first decent look at him. He was still obscured and sort of low-res from my vantage point, but I could make out that he was hunched over and wearing a ducking black cloak or blanket and not a coat and hoodie as I had assumed. At this point, I had convinced myself, for my sanity's sake, that he was some prankster looking to scare me, so I remained motionless and waited. It reminded me of the scene from The Lord of the Rings where the hobbits are hiding from the ring wraiths and Frodo is tempted to put the ring on, except the trembling ring in this scene was connected to my bowels. After a couple of seconds of searching, he decided to turn back the way he came. I really hoped that this joker wasn't some disabled homeless guy, and I'd made him take a detour, but I wasn't going to let him follow me either. I waited, watching him until he was out of sight and I couldn't hear his grunting, and he emerged quietly from the bushes. If he were near where I had first spotted him now, a bend in the road and distance in the darkness would totally obscure him. I trotted along the road, checking over my shoulder occasionally, until I reached my final boss level of the shortcut, where the recreational field ended and the path was now lined by trees on both sides. Glancing over my shoulder one more time before I entered this darker, creepier part of the path, my heart sank when I suddenly saw the hunchback once again behind me. It seemed impossible that he would have caught up unless he had pulled the same trick as I did. He was moving quickly now in a sort of lopsided gallop, grunting and wheezing loudly. I felt like I could take him in a fight but had no idea what was concealed under his blanket, so I started to jog, scared of going too fast as the path was uneven and I was at more risk of falling over in the dark. Luckily, the enclosed wooded area wasn't that wide, so I was quickly on the more even footpath next to the river, sprinting towards the footbridge, which is just above a weir. Behind me, the hunchback stopped and let out a long mournful cry that turned my blood to ice, half moan, half howl, weirdly animalistic. Once I reached the other side of the river, I was on open playing fields, not far from home. A young couple had been making out on a bench and leapt to their feet when they saw me coming. The guy asked me, "What the duck was that?" I shook my head and said, "I don't know, some psycho or something, I wouldn't stick around." They got up and quickly went off down the riverside path on this side of the bridge. I looked back one last time and saw his weird outline a split second before he melted into the darkness of the woods before I turned around and sprinted the rest of the way home. Several months later, and I feel my brain has done a number on me, making him seem hazy and non-corporeal almost in my mind. Since then, there have been a weird spike of bad incidents in the park, but one of the weirdest things about this all is that the Weir crossing is called Black Weir, and I entered a part of the park called Blackfriars because it was once the site of a Dominican religious order monastery. Whatever was happening, yours truly is not going back at night again. I was around 8-ish. We were having some work done in my bedroom, so I was sleeping in the same room as my parents. I woke up from a nightmare and needed to pee, so I headed for the bathroom. My dad was already in there, so I'd need to wait for him. There's a room between my parents' room and the bathroom, not mine, which was also being worked on, and the door was broken off the top hinge earlier that day, so it was hanging open a bit and you could see into the corner behind the door. I'm standing there waiting when I hear "Hey kid," and I turn. Standing behind the door with its head nearly at the ceiling, which was 10 feet, was this demonic looking thing smiling down at me. It had a blood red face and yellow teeth. The face is kind of burned into my mind. I used to say it looked like Darth Maul. It startled me, and just then, the door swung open from the bathroom. My dad comes out and sees my horrified face. When I told him what I saw, he thought it was childish imagination, but then the door slammed shut. He got me back to the bedroom quickly and grabbed his gun to go confront what I guess he thought was an intruder. Of course, no one was in there. While he was looking, a window suddenly shattered outward. There was a metal screen in the window that tore from the glass, but it didn't break enough for a full-sized body to get through, so it was just plain smashed. We never got an answer to what caused that, but weird shit started happening regularly. A little under 2 years ago, when I was living at my previous apartment complex, I had a dream that I woke up in my bed and there was someone standing at my bedside, leaning over me and holding me down by my arms. I think it was a woman. I don't recall being scared of this person in my dreams, and I don't remember enough now to say whether I recognized them. But then I noticed they had their heads turned towards the doorway of my bedroom. I lifted my head, trying to see, since I couldn't sit up because they were holding me down. Next, I see this black creature come into the doorway. It was maybe 2 feet tall. Thin. Black wings. I had one eye, kind of like a cyclops. It then leapt from my bedroom doorway to the foot of my bed and grabbed onto my ankles. I instantly woke up in fear, and my ankles felt like they were on fire. I sat up in bed and started rubbing them because they felt so sore. That's the only time this creature has visited me in my dreams, and I certainly hope that was the last time. The one experience that sticks out the most happened a few years after I started investigating. That would be about 84. Up until that point, I had never investigated an inhuman entity, aka a demon. I knew what I was getting into that evening. I had not experienced it before. In most investigations, you are just waiting for something to happen. That night, the moment I walked in the door, there was the heaviest, most oppressive feeling I had ever felt. Things were quiet, there were almost no sounds at all. Which was very odd, there are normally sounds in a home that is not vacant. Just nothing. The investigator I was with went to a second-floor room, a bedroom used for storage. Was the area most often affected. As far as I knew at this point, no one had been attacked or harmed. That all changed in the course of about 15 minutes. You never know what to expect with this type of entity. There is the Hollywood version, of course. This was just off, like something was about to go wrong really fast. We heard voices but could not make out what they were saying. We had a cassette tape deck, and when we played it back, all it captured was hissing. What really got me was not the voices, not even the heavy feeling. I could feel something moving around in that room. Now there were boxes stacked on 2 walls. A small window on one wall, and a small closet on the same wall. We were in the center of the room. Something was moving, I just have no idea what it could have been. Within a few moments, the room went silent, dead silent. I could not hear myself breathing. I knew I was, but I could not hear it. We sat for a few more moments, trying to make sense of all of what was happening. The room literally exploded into sound, voices banging on walls, and screams. It was very intense, the noise was louder than what you would expect at a concert. When it stopped, we walked out. Then the following person talked with the priest to see if he could help. That was the first and only time in all the years I have been investigating that I was truly frightened. This one stands out for me just because it got to me. My maternal grandparents lived in an old house in South Central Florida for years and were maybe 5 minutes off the Gulf Coast. At the time of the incident, there were very few people who lived around there. In fact, their closest neighbors were my paternal grandparents, who lived maybe a half-mile up the Lime Rock Road. Back then, there were no security lights in normal, red, poor, people's yards. And like I said, there was nothing but scrub oaks and palmetto bushes forever around their house. It was dark. One night, my first cousin and I were spending the night with our grandparents, and we were in my grandma's bedroom playing. Mama and Pawpaw had separate rooms because Pawpaw snored like a gaggle of chainsaws. Anyway, Mama had her bed just across from the door in the hallway, so it was the first thing you saw. She had a spare twin, maybe full-sized, I don't exactly remember, in the corner against the walls, about 6 to 8 feet away from her bed. Her closet door was near the foot of her bed, and the dresser was on the same wall as the door to enter her room from the hall. My cousin was on my mama's bed while I sat on the spare bed. We were throwing one of those cheap plastic balls back and forth to each other. There was one lamp on in the room, and if I recall correctly, it was on the dresser to my left. I tossed the ball back to my cousin, and it hit her square in the chest and hit the floor. I looked at her, but she was looking over my shoulder, her eyes wide open with an unmistakable look of sheer terror on her face. I turned and looked out the window, and staring back at me through the window were two glowing red eyes. They were no more than 3 to 4 feet from my face, with only the glass of the panes between us. I remember being startled and thinking, now what is that? But I don't remember being scared. Just kidding, I was maybe 5 to 6 years old. I screamed, as did my cousin, and we both hauled asses out of that room and did not go back that night. Now out my grandma's window were the backyard and porch. The porch was maybe 18 inches off the ground, and the window was another 18 to 24 inches or so higher than that. To be as close to me as it would have to have been standing on the back porch. Thinking back on it now, I would place the eyes at 24 to 36 inches above the surface of the porch. Now, having said all that, I do not believe that it was anything paranormal, unlike my cousin, who swears to this day that we saw the eyes of a demon. I feel like it could have been a bear, as the Florida black bear was quite common in the area at that time, or maybe even a Florida panther. I have no idea if either of those animals' eyes reflect a reddish hue. I know it wasn't a deer, at least not a normal deer, as their eyes reflect a greenish/blue color. This happened to me about 10 years ago, when I was 14. It was a warm summer night in 2012, and I, 14 years old at the time, was walking around the city with my friends R, 16 years old, and his older cousin J, 24 years old. We had all been neighbors for about 4 years now, and our families knew each other, so it was quite normal for us to all be hanging out together despite the age gaps. During our walk, we decided to take a shortcut through the cemetery. It was after hours, and I'm pretty sure it was illegal for us to be in there at that time, but we weren't doing anything other than cutting through, which we would often do during the day as well. As we were walking down the path, we saw headlights turning into the cemetery, and the boys, of course, darted way ahead of me into the tree line. Since the boys ran ahead of me off the path and away from the lights, it was pitch black. There was residual light twinkling through the branches as I made my way down into the trees, but it dropped down to a slight hill, and the light was lost. I was walking along, trying to be as quiet as possible, almost blind due to my eyes not adjusting yet, and that was when the feeling of dread set in. I had no idea where the boys were, I couldn't see, and I didn't want to be caught by the police by myself, but there was something else. There was almost a chill in the air on this warm night in July. I tried to brush off this uneasy feeling, thinking it was just my nerves or being scared because the boys took off without me, but alarms were going off in my head like something was very wrong and, apart from legal reasons, I should not be there. I make out a shape to the left of me as I'm walking. I take a couple steps toward it. Guys, is that you? Nothing. No response. I take a few more steps forward, and I swear to God that, just like in the movies, a freaking twig snaps under my foot. Now, the reason I thought it was the boys is because this shape was crouched down next to a pile of brush and was big enough to look like two people hunching over. I thought they had been hiding there, but when the twig snapped, I stopped in my tracks as this thing stood up and towered over me. I was about 5 feet tall at the time, and this thing was easily two of me stacked right on top of each other. Whatever this thing was, it was only 15 feet or so away from me, and I was frozen with horror. It was facing away from me at first, then its neck and head almost swiveled around like an owl, and I was met with an oval-shaped gray face with no nose or mouth, only two itchy black hollow eye sockets. The rest of this thing's body was pitch black against the dark trees, and the light from the path was no longer streaming through the branches. It was just me and this thing that seemed like the personification of darkness itself. This thing and I stared at each other for what felt like an eternity. The woods around me through the corners of my eyes were getting darker, and my heart was pounding so hard I could feel it through my entire body. Every tiny hair on my body was prickling. I was cold. The only thing I can remember thinking was, this is it. I'm never going to see my family again. The body of this thing had followed its head and swiveled, so now I could see its long, curved arms held right up to what would be this thing's chest. Its legs were similarly curved, almost like it wasn't standing at full height but still slightly crouching down. Its body was almost translucent, and it looked like it was wearing some kind of hooded cloak that was see-through as well. The only thing that was 100% solid was its face and its void-like eyes, which made me feel like I was staring right into the depths of hell. Neither of us moved. We were locked in the most terrifying staring contest for what felt like an eternity until a strange feeling came over me. I felt like I could move again, and I had the energy to run a 5K marathon without breaking a sweat. Then, I heard a very calm but stern voice say, "Go. Now. Run." It's kind of hard to explain exactly where the voice was coming from. It was sort of in my head but all around me at the same time. I'm getting chills as I write this. I know the voice did not come from whatever this thing was in front of me, because when I heard the voice speak, it looked as if this horrid creature recoiled at the sound of it. It took a step or two backwards and kind of ducked its head down. I saw this as my chance, and I turned away from this thing. I started bolting down further into the tree line, no longer caring about being quiet, and crashing around through the bush like an animal being chased by some predator. I could almost feel this thing right on my tail, but after running about 200 feet-ish, I ran directly into the boys. Literally crashing into them. I'm obviously scared and pissed, so I asked why they left me like that, and they apologized. Apparently, I had been missing for almost half an hour, and they had already searched the direction I ran from. They heard weird whispering voices all around the woods while I was gone. Like the voices were coming from everywhere around them. They said that right before I crashed into them, the whispering stopped. I told them about what I saw, and all they said was that we should get out of here. We left the cemetery very quickly, and as soon as we walked out of the gates, it was like we all let out this sigh of relief. We never talked about that night again, and even during the day, none of us ever took that shortcut through the cemetery. I still live in the same city, and to this day, I avoid it like the plague. I won't even drive by it. This isn't my only story, but it's definitely one of the more terrifying ones that still haunts me to this day. The Old Mill House. Katie was 21 and from Devon in the UK. She had always been very open to the supernatural, and she believed that there had to be some sort of life after death. The following is Katie's account of a paranormal experience she experienced while living in a house that was once an old mill. The house we were living in was called the Old Mill. My parents and I moved there when I was 14. It was a converted mill that still had a water wheel on the side. It didn't move, it had been inactive for some time, along with all the cogs and workings of the wheel inside. It's been various different mills in its time, a sawmill, a paper mill, and a flour mill. It was converted into a house in the 1950s, but the oldest parts of the house date back to the 12th century. I never really sensed anything when we first viewed the house. I just found the history of the building fascinating, and it was a beautiful house, so I was excited to move there. It was about 6 months after we moved that a man first appeared to me in my bedroom. I remember the first time I saw him, I thought someone had broken in. I remember screaming and yelling to my parents, "There's someone in the house." But by the time they got there, he had vanished. We searched the house and found nothing. There were no signs of him. I was a bit freaked out for a while, and I thought maybe my mind was just playing tricks with me. But then I saw him again, about a week later, in the exact same spot in the corner of my bedroom. I remember being home alone and screaming, "What do you want?" At this point, I still believed it was someone breaking in. I remember scrambling for my phone, ready to dial 999. But then he spoke to me and said, "I just want to be friends. I used to live here, I just want to visit and see what you've done with the place." So I asked him when he lived here, and that's when he said 1874. I thought he was kidding, but then I noticed his clothing, and it was very old-fashioned, very Victorian era. He wore a brown suit and held a top hat. I screamed again and ran out into the garden. Then, when I went back in, he was gone. I was so freaked out. I didn't tell my parents because they would think I was out of my mind and seeing things. The next time he reappeared, he told me his name was Arthur. I always found it strange that he appeared in the exact same spot in the corner of my room. I also noticed he had a lot of bruising around his neck. I asked him about it once, but he looked very sheepish and then disappeared. He didn't look that old, sort of episode. When I told him we were moving, he was very angry and told me, "You're mine." That's when the figures of 2 girls appeared. Every time they appeared, he would disappear. They were about the same age I was at the time, 15/16. One of them spoke to me, her name was Mary, and she just said that I needed to leave, to get out, and to save myself from him. I believed her. There was even one time when Mary possessed me. I have no recollection of any of it. So I'll just tell you what my parents told me about it as they witnessed it. I was lying in bed crying, and they were there comforting me. Apparently, my body went stiff for around 5 to 10 seconds. And then I started talking, but it wasn't my voice at all. I was saying, "Get out, get out." You need to protect yourselves from him, save yourselves. And then I had a coughing fit and came back to myself. When my parents and I eventually moved out of the house, it felt like a breath of fresh air. Like a weight had been lifted off our shoulders. Luckily, the sale of my parents' business meant we could buy and move into a new house before selling the old mill. I'm very appreciative that we managed to do that because I was just at the point where I needed to be out of that house. When we moved into our new home, we got to chat with one of our neighbors, and it turned out that he was a medium. We told him about all of our experience with the old house, and he offered to go down there with one of his medium friends to see if they picked up on anything. Now we didn't tell him all the details, but what he and his medium friend found out was amazing. It turns out that Arthur was a priest who lived there in the 1870s. It turned out he had held 2 girls captive there, Mary and Elizabeth, and he accidentally killed them. He felt so guilty and ashamed of what he did that he ended up hanging himself, you guessed it, in the corner of what would become my bedroom. We managed to sell the house a year ago. We did tell the new owners that we had some spiritual activity, but we didn't tell them the full extent of it all. We didn't want to sell the house to a family that had any young girls, as we didn't want them to experience anything similar to what I did. Luckily, it was a lovely elderly couple who bought it, and when we told them about it being slightly haunted, they thought it was rather splendid. I've now become very aware of the fact that I can sense spirits. Even in the home we live in, I sense my grandparents, who passed away a few years ago. I wouldn't say I would never again live in a haunted house because I feel all houses have history to them, even new builds, as there will be history to the land they're built on. Just as long as the spirits are friendly and wish me no harm. I was fresh out of college, and I decided to take a trip out west with my girlfriend. We decided to fly to a state of our choosing, rent a car, and make a road trip out of it. Some nights we were going to camp at public campgrounds, and other nights we booked various Airbnbs along our route. On this one night, it just so happened that the area we would end up in after a full day of driving was fairly desolate. Instead of camping, we decided to stay at an Airbnb about 45 minutes from where we were during the day. It was described as a sanctuary for animals, and it was run by a shaman. I put the directions in the GPS, and we headed on our way. This particular region was extremely desolate and mountainous. We were on a dirt road that ended up being steeper and more windy than anticipated, but our rental car was able to handle the terrain with no problem. As the area became more and more desolate, I began to wonder if I had put the wrong coordinates in the GPS, but I figured I'd drive a bit longer, and it paid off. We finally came upon the building we were set to stay in. We probably arrived around 4 to 5 p.m., and as soon as we pulled into the parking lot, I began to feel uneasy. There was something off about the area. I couldn't pinpoint what it was, but my gut was telling me to leave. Of course, there were no other places around us, so we were stuck where we were. I looked around and saw fenced-in fields, but I don't recall seeing animals, which I thought was strange, though they could have been boarded somewhere. We unpacked our things from the car, and we walked up to the door. There was a note taped on the door that said something along the lines of "Be back soon, follow self-check-in instructions." I found this to be extremely odd because the sign looked like it had remained taped in that same spot for months on end. I shrugged it off, and we followed the check-in instructions. Upon entering the building, I felt even more uneasy. We entered into this large room, more like a hall of some sort. In that room, there were 20+ plastic lawn chairs set up in a circle. The first thought that came to my head when I saw these was cult. Again, we shrugged it off and explored the rest of the building to find our room. Aside from the creepy hall, the rest of the building was rustic and very cool, though it looked like no one had been in the building for a long time. It was just sort of musty and legitimately empty. There were like 8 suites in this building, and we were the only ones there. There was no sign of life until a bit later, when a different couple arrived. They seemed fairly normal, but they kept to themselves, as did we. We set up our things in our room, and I still couldn't shake the negativity I was feeling. My girlfriend suggested we burn some Palo Santo wood to neutralize the energy, so I lit one up in our room, thinking nothing of it. A few minutes after I put the ember out on the wood, the sky started to darken. All of a sudden, the wind began to pick up, and vegetation began swaying. Thinking it was interesting to see, my girlfriend and I went out on the little deck attached to our room and stood outside in the wind. It felt great, and we were having a good time, but our good time didn't last long. The wind picked up even more and started blowing sand very heavily. Soon, chairs started blowing over outside and then legitimately continued to blow 50 to 100 feet, maybe farther. We decided to go back inside to the kitchen and start our dinner. In the kitchen, we were met by an odd woman who said she had worked at the bed and breakfast for years. She had a very creepy, monotone voice, talked very oddly, and seemed extremely lethargic. We then asked her if the tap water was safe to drink, and she responded, Yes, it's some of the best water I've ever had. The way she said it made my spine tingle. I made quick eye contact with my girlfriend. I'm not drinking that ducking water. Another woman came into the kitchen. It was the shaman. She greeted us in an extremely cold manner, almost like she was upset we were there. She turned around, walked to a window, and just stared out the window for a while. While staring out the window, she said in a low, frustrated voice, "I don't like how we fed the animals tonight." After staring for a while longer, she made her way back to the center of the kitchen and talked about how it wasn't supposed to storm today. She continued on and said, "Something must have made the ancestors upset. Duck, was it my Palo Santo?" I immediately began to question what I did and wonder if I had made someone angry, all while trying to remain composed. Another person entered the room. It was a younger woman, either my age or a few years younger, 19, 20. She, too, was lethargic and did not talk much. The shaman began ordering her around in a rude manner, and I instantly felt uncomfortable. The shaman went on to tell the girl she would not be able to eat dinner tonight, however, she was to drink a special herb mixture the shaman concocted for her. Meanwhile, my girlfriend and I are trying to act normal, finish making our mac and cheese, and lock ourselves in our room. We made it to our room, and at this point, we were completely creeped out. The negative feeling stayed with me, and I told my girlfriend I wanted to leave first thing in the morning. That night, I didn't sleep a wink. The whole time, I felt like something was watching me. I have no idea what was going on at the shaman's animal sanctuary, and I never want to stay long enough to find out. I genuinely think this shaman was up to no good and dealing with some very bad spirits. Part of me even wonders if this shaman was practicing shapeshifting. A fenced-in animal sanctuary seems like a good place for that. All I know is that we woke up at 4 a.m. and got the duck out of there. A couple of months ago, my boyfriend and I were sitting in my bedroom alone. We started hearing a consistent banging noise, almost like somebody was chopping wood, so we wrote it off as that at first. Well, it started getting louder, so I went outside to see if I could hear it out there, and alas, I could not. So I came back into the house and started hearing it again. So I put my ear to the wall, and I could hear it loud and clear. My boyfriend was on the opposite side of the room, and he put his ear to the wall as well, and no joke, we both felt this massive wave of energy rush through the room like a strong gust of wind, and then the banging was directly next to his ear. That's not even the scary part, though. We both looked at each other like WTF, then 2 seconds later we heard this god-awful, unhumane screech in the hallway right outside my door. Just thinking about that screech sends chills up my spine. Like nobody else was there. Now my boyfriend is a 35-year-old very logical and practical guy who has never really believed in paranormal stuff. Well, when we heard that screech, I had never seen that man so scared. He says that incident made him believe in the paranormal. I've been experiencing stuff like this my whole life and have always thought I have a demon attached to me. This is just one of many incidents, and not even the worst one. I'm not sure where to even start. Before I moved into my apartment, my mother and stepfather had previously lived there. When they lived there, I happened to find a Ouija board under their bed. I asked my stepdad if I could have it, and he said sure. The second I lifted it from under the bed, the cross on my bracelet broke off. I didn't want to tell my stepdad, because I knew if he heard what happened to the cross, he wouldn't let me take the board. After I left his apartment, I took the board and put it in my car to drive back to my dad's house, where I was living at the time. As I was driving, the angel in my car broke off my sun visor and landed in my lap. I had the chills but shrugged it off as a coincidence. Later on that week, me, my cousin, and his girlfriend decided to play it. Nothing happened when we played it at all, except for my cat scaring us by jumping in the middle of the table unexpectedly. We closed up the board and went on with life, but things started happening, weird things that wouldn't go away. At the time this took place, I was 18 years old. I was getting depressed randomly and kept seeing things move in my house, like chairs and blankets, but no one believed me. One night I was sleeping, and all I remember is waking up kneeling on my bed with my hands up against the wall as my head was looking up. I had no idea why I was in that position, but my eyes were wide open and I couldn't move. I had no control over my body. My cousin walked into my bedroom because he saw the light turned on. As he walked in, he yelled my name, and I instantly regained physical energy from my body again. I was trying to explain to him, I don't know what was going on, but he seemed so creeped out that he didn't want to hear it. Things started getting out of hand as my dog, who never growls, wouldn't come into my room and kept growling at my door. One night I was sleeping, and when I opened my eyes, I saw some shadow figure standing above me. I screamed so loudly that I woke up my dad, and as I went to run out of my room, the light bulb popped, and I got a sharp pain in my knee that made me fall and couldn't walk. I screamed so loudly that my neighbors heard me. My dad came running to find me in the hall, crying on the floor. We had the house blessed and me blessed, but that only helped for a little as whatever it was came back. I happened to go to a club with my friend one night, and as we were listening to the radio, my Bluetooth switched on and started playing a song called The Blood of Christ. It was a scary song, nothing godly at all. The song was shown to have never been downloaded but still appeared on my playlist. I didn't feel up to going out anymore, so we just went back to my friend's house. But while we were there, we kept hearing footsteps in her house when no one but us was home, and then, out of nowhere, her bedroom door slammed shut. She thinks whatever it is attached to me. Well, the story, believe me, continues on, but even more strange things happened when I moved into my mom and stepdad's apartment when they moved out to take over their lease. Whatever ever started in that apartment is back, and I am currently 25 years old, and who or whatever it is not done. This Saturday, 5/29, me and my two good friends were hanging out. Every time we are together, we like to go for drives at night along this one road. Sometimes we stop by some local parks and walk around, just talking or messing around. This time, we decided to stop by a field where we planned to kick a soccer ball around. It was around 2 a.m., and the area seemed pretty dead except for the occasional passing car or ranger closing the park. When we arrived at the field, we noticed a newly built playground was now in the field, and we thought it would be cool to just mess around on it. First, I parked the car and faced the high beams towards the field, leaving it running so we could use it to see what we were doing. Then we got out and started passing around the soccer ball, enjoying the weird vibes of it all, and having a loud conversation. After a bit, we got bored and decided to go to the playground. I reparked the car so the high beams were facing it, and once again we got out and started heading towards it. The playground consists of a large, castle-like structure in the middle, surrounded by balance obstacles, balance beams, wavy bridges, etc. We headed towards the main castle, taking our time, strolling on the obstacles, and again enjoying the effect the high beams had on the environment. Looking back at the car, all I could see was our silhouettes, and if you looked at the playground, our figures cast long, pitch black shadows on the castle, adding to the feeling that parts of the castle were shrouded and hidden. As I took one more step closer to the castle, however, these feelings of excitedness and mild spookiness were slightly tarnished. I was hit with the smell of a cigarette, as if someone were smoking one just in front of me. Not realizing the implications, I called out for one of my friends and told them I smelled a cigarette. They said they didn't and stepped closer. They smelled it, too. Part joking and part serious, I said, "What if there's someone over there smoking a cigarette?" Being the skittish and on-edge kids we were, we ran back to the car, laughing and joking. Once we sat down in the car, my friend suggested we drive around and scan the playground for anyone there, as we were now extremely curious. I took the car and drove it in a circle, then back around, sweeping from the right side of the playground to the left, exposing nothing. We then realized we had left the soccer ball on the field, so I drove the car into the field, and my friend stepped out and grabbed it. After this, we decided to do one last sweep and then get the hell out of there, as we were kind of spooked at this point. I scanned the playground with the high beams one last time and then stopped the car, facing the playground. We sat there for around 15 seconds on our phones, about to drive off, when it happened. My friend sitting in the back seat was the first to see it, starting to say something like, "Do you guys see that?" And then I looked up. Underneath the wooden beams of the now ominous castle, we saw a shape. A blurry red circle with a white center is moving as if it were a person. I know that doesn't make sense, but that's all I can say. It appeared as if it started from the back of the castle and was moving in a creature-like manner towards the front of the castle. Towards us. In this split second of silence as we watched this, I unconsciously slammed the car into reverse and began very quickly spinning to get 180, and now remembering that moment, I have never felt that much fear in my entire life. Something about the way that thing was moving made me feel so unbelievably petrified. My stomach felt like it was thrown off a cliff, and my hair stood straight like a bed of nails. All three of us were now screaming, and I quickly and sloppily drove away. We had all seen the exact same thing. We were now driving away and began to calm down just a little, and we began wondering what the duck that thing was. I assumed it was probably some homeless person who had gone under the playground for a smoke or something. To be sure, we decided we would drive past again and try to get a better look at the playground, maybe seeing that what we had seen was some part of the playground, or maybe catching the person who had walked out from under the castle in a better light. As we came nearer to the playground, the tension began rising again, and I began to pull into the road that was connected to the parking lot. As I turned, my beams glanced over the playground for a second and then over the road. On the side of the road, there was a man. He was dressed in a full sweat clothing outfit, with his hood over a baseball hat and a Swiss Army backpack. I quickly sped by him, and we felt as though we may have gotten our answer. We kept driving for a few seconds, then realized we had not seen any red on him. It was all white. I decided to turn back around and get a better look at this man to get some closure. When I went back on the same road, he was not there anymore. I assumed he ducked into the woods or something, so I kept going back towards my friend's house, deciding to return home. Taking the turn back onto the main road, though, we saw him again. This time, he was walking in the complete opposite direction, unrealistically far from where we first saw him, again with his back to us. This was the cherry on top of the weirdness, and we drove back home in a state of excited terror. The one thing that we couldn't stop repeating was the fact that whatever or whoever that was had been there the whole time. Under the castle, simply watching and listening to us. If I had simply ignored the cigarette smoke and gone to the castle, they would have been under us, just observing. I could have pretty easily made this story sound much more than it was, adding the detail that the playground was built to memorialize a boy who was killed in a horrific lawnmower accident, but I don't think that would properly portray what we experienced. I have no idea what we saw, and when we got back to my friend's house, we started analyzing photos of the playground from different angles, trying to see if there was something that looked like what we saw, but we couldn't find anything. I used to love the woods. I loved the quiet, peace, and tranquility of the forest, the sort of haven that gave me a minor distraction from the outside world. I would go exploring a lot when I was a kid and eat up any sort of nature documentary I could get my hands on. That was until I moved into my most recent house. Now I stay far away from those woods. I often go on my porch at night and just stare at the tree line as my eyes gaze into the impenetrable darkness. I know there's something there, just out of sight, grazing back at me. My property dates back to the 1800s, and it is a true 1800s looking property. The original house I used to live in here was something out of an old-timey scary movie. The same could be said with the barn on my property. Either way, everything here was built by the original owners way back when they were making the buildings, and this property is very, very old. And I partly think this relates to the problems I've had here. I usually don't tell these stories, but I feel like maybe someone will understand. I'll talk about the main problem, which is the woods. These encounters took place over the course of 10 years. The knocks. I was sitting down by the river behind my house with my grandfather one afternoon. We were fishing and having a good time. I was thrilled with spending time with my grandfather, and fishing at the time was our favorite activity. I remarked to him about a Bigfoot hunting show I was watching on TV and found out he watched the same show. A big part of the Bigfoot show is knocking on trees with wood to make a big sound. The rumor is that Bigfoot will knock back to communicate with you. I always had a strange feeling about those woods, something just wasn't right about them. There were two sides connected by a bridge. One side was the one my grandfather and I were on. This side is warm and nice, birds sing and crickets do their thing, but on the other side of the river, once you cross that bridge, it's dead, no noise, no sun, no cold, no birds, no crickets, no animals, and all the plants there are dead. You get a chill running down your spine and instantly feel like you just shouldn't be there. Yay, I always had a weird vibe about it, so joking around with my grandfather, I took a block of wood and banged it against the nearest tree. We laughed until we heard a bang come from the woods. My grandfather stopped dead in his tracks and gazed deep into the woods. I banged twice. It banged twice back. I banged 3 times. It banged 3 times. I banged once. It banged once, until finally the banging just stopped. My grandfather brushed it off, but something about it didn't settle right with me. I made up my mind at that moment to find out what made that noise, a decision I would come to regret. The screams. Fast forward a couple of months, and I was in the very same woods with a friend and her dad, only on the other side of them. As we walked, I told her the story about the knocks. And kids being kids, we decided to name the monster in my woods, and I'm not very proud to admit we settled on Jerry. When we got to the heart of the woods, we found 3 broken down cars down there, like old cars from the 1960s. They're arranged in the shape of a triangle, separated by a couple of yards between them. One on top of a hill, the other in a clearing, and the last one in the middle of some brush. No roads lead into those woods, there are only rickety old bridges that are half rotten, so I don't even know why they are there. We all walk up to the cars and look at them. I never go into the woods without a walking stick. Being a young boy, I take the stick and give the car a good hit. My friend laughs, but as soon as I hit that ducking car, all hell broke loose. I'm not talking about anger screaming, I'm talking about the type of screaming someone does when they're about to die. It sounded like a woman was getting butchered right in front of us, and it didn't stop. It kept getting louder and louder, and it was all around us. My friend and I freaked out. I went to ask her dad what he thought. When I looked up at him, I saw complete and utter fear. This guy grew up in the heart of mass. He doesn't scare easily. Seeing him like that, his face completely pale just staring into the brush, was awful. All he said was "let's go," and as we were walking out, the screaming continued. As we left the area, it kept screaming louder and louder until we crossed the bridge. As soon as our bodies broke the threshold of the bridge, the screams completely stopped. Knox Part 2. After that encounter, the same friend made it our mission to find Jerry and find out exactly what it was. In hindsight, this was very stupid, but I was just a dumb kid, and I didn't know it would lead to everything it did. We were talking about my first encounter and about the knocking. She got the idea to try and use the knocks to communicate. It seemingly wasn't a bad idea, and I figured it couldn't hurt to try. I knew something was out there, and I just wanted answers. "Knock once if you don't want us to go into the woods," I yelled across the river. We waited about 15 seconds until there was a knock, but this wasn't like the first one. This knock sounded like it came from metal on metal, very similar to the sound the car in the woods made when I hit it with a stick. "Knock twice if you want us to stay on this side of the bridge." Again, 2 knocks. One right after the other, sounding like it was beating on those old cars. I was stunned by the first set of knocks, sure that there could have been someone ducking with me. But the second pair of knocks had the same event happening twice, only this time it was using the knocks to communicate with us. I asked it again to knock if it didn't want us out there, and it knocked as soon as I asked the question. This taught me 3 things. 1. It did not want us out there poking around, but what could it be hiding? 2. It's the cars. Something about those cars, when I hit them, those screams came for us, and now it was using them to communicate. Finally, whatever it is, it's smart and it can communicate. This freaked me out because answering questions shows intelligence and understanding. It has its own set of wants and desires that it can communicate. And it's strong enough to bang on a metal car, meaning it can interact with the physical world. Imposter, this was the last hunt my friend joined me on. We were walking down to the river, spinning our thoughts and theories about Jerry. We knew it could communicate, we knew it didn't want us in the woods, we knew it could interact with physical objects, and lastly, we knew there was something about those cars. We got down into the clearing where the river is and were about to start walking into the woods when we heard Carly. We heard her mother's voice call her name and didn't think anything of it. We figured she wanted her to come out of the woods. So we left the river and walked back up to my house, where we found her mom. Sitting in her car with heavy death metal music blasting, she knocked on her mom's window, and her mom opened it. "Hey, did you call my name earlier?" "No, I've been sitting here listening to music." My heart sank when we heard her name. It wasn't just me that heard it, she heard it too. We both looked at each other and instantly thought the same thing. That thing changed its voice to sound like her mom, and it knew her name. We never ended up going into the woods that day, and I often wonder if it called her name to distract us, so we never got to go out and look for it. Either way, that's the last time she helped me search for it. My new partner, 3 branches snapping as something walked through them. It was easy to tell something was following us the whole time. Watching us from afar and keeping track of our movements, we felt like animals being stalked from afar. One day I was sitting in a tree, surveying the land. And that's when I saw an arm just sitting on a tree. The arm was wrapped around the tree like it was hugging it. Its skin was black and gray like the bark of the trunk. I only saw it because it had happened to pick up its arm and move it behind the tree. During another investigation, we were in the woods one day doing an investigation when suddenly I felt a cold chill go up to my spine. I felt it behind me. I don't know how, but I said, "Jimmy, take a picture behind me right now." He snapped the photo without question, and that's when we saw it. Standing behind me was a small figure, probably about 5 feet tall, in completely black robes with a hood covering its head and no face. I was stunned. I couldn't believe it. In the photo, there was a hooded shadow figure standing behind me. Of course, this only piqued my curiosity. I was so stupid that I had this thing telling me not to go in the woods, but yet I would go in the woods. This is why people die in horror movies. What did Jerry look like? While I did get that picture, I don't think that was its true form, or at least that wasn't the only one out there. This is the part I completely and utterly hate, and I wish it never happened. On one of our investigations, something went wrong. The footsteps were too close. And things were moving in and out of the tree line. Sam and Jimmy booked it out of the woods. Fighting to get to the bridge because as soon as we crossed that bridge, the activity instantly died, and whatever was out there either couldn't cross or didn't want to. We're running through the trees, feeling dreadful like something was coming, and I wish I never turned my head to look to my right. I heard something over there, and I don't know why, but I decided to look. Its shape was that of a human, but it had no features. It was broad daylight, yet its skin was completely black, like a shadow. Its arms were super long, and it was so skinny that it almost looked like a stick figure. I could make out its head, arm, and torso, which were human in shape, but then its legs were bent backward like a dog or a wolf. It moved on all fours, so ducking fast, quicker than anything I've ever seen in my life. I'm a horse farmer, and I've seen horses run full speed, and this thing made them look slow. I just happened to turn my head at the right moment. I locked eyes with it in that split second. Well, it didn't have any eyes, but I could feel it look at me, and at that moment, I knew I saw something I was never supposed to see. It was running beside me, but I was never meant to see that. It ran by a tree and disappeared into thin air. I've never run so fast in my life. I was terrified. What the duck was it? That thing wasn't some small little thing in a hood. This was some sort of animal, human mix, or something. It was awful. The goat. In one of the last encounters I had with Jerry, I was walking down to the river. All of a sudden, the wind picked up out of nowhere, and the trees started bending and dancing in the wind. And then a laugh cut through the woods, an evil laugh, a menacing laugh, followed by a goat belting louder than anything I've ever heard. That was the last time I went down there. It was the first time something had happened on my side of the bridge, the safe side. Jerry always stayed by his side and never came over to mine. Well, he changed that, and I threw in the towel. I was never going out there again. I had eyewitnesses. I had evidence. I had locked eyes with the thing, and now it was coming over to my side of the river, invading my home like I invaded it. I was done, and I told him that. I went to the river one last time. The wind picked up again instantly, with trees whipping all around the woods and groaning all around me. And I apologized for everything for going out there and disturbing its home. After hitting the car to actually try to hunt it, I apologized and told that thing I never wanted to see or hear from it ever again. As soon as I said those words, the wind died, the trees stilled, and the woods made noise again. I agreed to never go into his woods, as long as he never crossed the bridge again. If he stayed on his side, I agreed to stay on mine. One last encounter. It had been a couple of months since my deal had been struck, and the activity in the woods slowed to zero. There was nothing if you went down there. It was still creepy, but nothing at all like before. I had wondered if my otherworldly friend had gone to wherever he came from. However, one of my friends slept over. I told him about my story with Jerry, and he didn't. Believe me, he ran outside, onto my porch, and before I could stop him, he yelled into the woods, "I'm not scared of you, you're a coward." I asked him to stop, but he yelled it again and said, "I'm not scared. I got God on my side." He was cut off by the sound of metal crunching down on metal. His face turned white, and fear poured into his eyes. He had yelled at Jerry and called him out, and Jerry responded with one of his signature knocks. My friend ran back into my house, freaking out really bad, asking me, "What the duck is it? What the duck is out there?" So we sat down in my room, and he let me tell him more. It was then that we both heard Craig as my doorknob turned, and with a pop, my door opened slowly and slowly, inching its way until it was completely open. The whole time, I and my friend watched it, holding our breaths as fear consumed us. He was even more freaked out than before and left the next day, telling his family what had happened as he got into the car. Jerry had never left like I thought he might have. He was simply waiting and listening until he had to make himself known again. Closing thoughts. After my run-in with Jerry and even more spirits on my property, my mom was sitting down with an old-timer of the town we live in. They were talking about ghosts, and she told her my story, which the old-timer revealed. When she was a young girl, a bunch of town officials got into trouble. Because it was discovered, they were all part of a satanic cult, even the sheriff was a part of it. The rumor around town is that they even did rituals and sacrificed people. Do I think Jerry is a byproduct of that? I don't know. Do I think that hooded figure is connected? I don't know. I've been trying to figure out for years what happened out there and, most importantly, what that thing I saw was. If you have any ideas, feel free to let me know. After the activity with Jerry died down, I still encountered many spirits on my property, yet I know nothing. The only thing I do know is that those woods are his, and I'm never going out there again. It's been about 3 years now since Jerry and I've had no run-ins with him since I still get curious and wonder if he's still out there. But when I look into the woods and feel those eyes staring back,